Hello, welcome back to a new episode of the Urban Manifesto. And we went back after a long break, and we hope to continue our monthly programming, the rest of the year. And as you all know, we launched this series while this pandemic had just begun, and we recognize that it was a difficult moment, but it was also a very important moment to think about how to build back better. And in Urban Manifesto, we've actually been drawing out and reimagining a roadmap to transform our cities to better, more inclusive, livable, happier, and healthier. I'm Pratima Manohar from the Think Do Tank, the Urban Vision, and I'm so thrilled to bring these important conversations to all of you with my colleague, Lucy Bullivant, who's the founder of urbanista.org. Lucy, over to you to introduce our guest for today and our theme for today.
Thank you very much, Prathima. It's such a pleasure to be back after our winter break. So today we are returning with a punch. We are going to grapple with the very vital task of remaking the civic cities, so-called dark matter, and the building of new infrastructures through systemic design. And we're going to do that with one of the most qualified individuals that I know, today with our splendid guest, Indy Johar, who is an architect and the co-founder of Architecture 00 practice and Dark Matter Labs, which is his international consultancy business network. And Indy is also Mayor of London, Good Growth by Design advocate. He's a senior innovation associate with the Young Foundation and a visiting professor at Sheffield University's Department of Architecture. Now, Indy is really indefatigable in championing systems change on of all kinds, and he has a thrilling track record in this field. And I must say that he's the only futures thinker and doer who really doesn't talk to you about cool gadgets, but he really talks to you about the need for a boring revolution, as he deadpans in a 2018 lecture that you can find online. So, Indy, welcome to you very much. It's a delight to have you here on Urban Manifesto. And what I'm going to just quickly point out for our audience, because some of our audience members may be saying, well, what is dark matter? I need to be reminded, or I didn't know what it was in the first place. So dark matter is at the heart of the boring revolution, so to speak. And at Dark Matter Labs, what they do is they build new support networks for collaborative systems change. And they make it their business to discover, design, and develop institutional dark matter, which they call the invisible structures, so-called the policy, regulation, finance, data, governance, and organizational culture, moreover, the identity of society and democratic participation. So for our talk today, we put in the poster, we added the slogan, transitioning to symbiotic systems. Because we are really keen to know more about Dark Matter Labs systems thinking, because it will really help, we feel, that to transition existing systems in societies across the world, which are dysfunctional, atavistic, looking back to the past, well by their sell-by date, into ones that are genuinely based on empowered and empowering human interconnections. Ones that are tragically not yet valued by a market-led worldview, which treasures GDP growth above all things. And ultimately, we want to move to systems being hand in hand with systems being, which is head, heart, hands together. So, Indy, over to you to present the manifesto for our session today.
Thank you. Firstly, I'm super delighted and honored to be a part of this conversation. I think it's a vital conversation. Now, my manifesto is for the future is based on the transformation of a reality of a world of defining independence to a world of defining interdependence. That is, I think, one of the big transformations we're in the midst of. A transformation where declarations of independence were the things of stories and the things of courageous acts of human being to the acts of declarations of interdependence at a structural level. I put forth to this brilliant group of people that this transition is a function of a 500-year revolution of Newtonian, from all the way from Vitruvian man, and it was man by Leonardo da Vinci, symbolized in a circle and a square as a kind of as a Platonic idea of what it means to be an individual human, to all the way from Newtonian physics and the kind of idea of cause and effect and linear models of thinking, which allowed us to see the world through the kind of Enlightenment thesis, which allowed us to see the world by subjugating and breaking everything up into definable objects, in vitro, putting everything into in vitro isolation. And in an infinite world, which it perceptibly was from the mind space of that moment of that revolution, the idea of objecthood was an inherent quality of, that facilitated comprehension of the world. And that was the centerpiece of actually dividing, separating, and seeing the world through separation and division. I think we're now in a different age, and the age that we're in is in a world of interdependence, a world of massive interdependence between the way we see the world, our relationship with the world, and our comprehension of the world. And that goes all the way from quantum physics and other frameworks of that, all the way through to how we perceive we understand the human body through a framework of interdependence. We know increasingly that we are a function of epigenetics and our relationship with the world. We understand that the brain is a social brain in terms of our networks and sociability of our brain. We know the impacts of poverty transcend time and are transmitted through time and space. And then I think as we go further into the future, we start to see that interdependence is also with our biological systems. The human itself is actually a mere waveform on the sea of nature. We are virtually indivisible from it. And I would say the 1970s picture of the astronaut in space is the most significant malinterpretation of the future. And because it allowed us to see the human in vitro from the world. And I think that is a real fundamental challenge. So I think we're in a new age of interdependence. And I think that new age of interdependence is vital into that process. And we need to start to see the future through a completely different lens. And that interdependence means that when we look at the future and our relationship with it, we have to reconfigure our relationship with the future. Currently, it's very clear to me that we see the risks coming to us, but we do not manifest the risks that are manifesting to the future. We do not worry about the risks that we're generating for future generations. They're unpriced and unvalued into the system. Our relationship with nature, which is that of resource and consumption. So fundamentally, we see a tree and the value of its timber, not in terms of environmental services and all the ecological microbiome effects that it generates. We see a tree through its objecthood. Our relationship with it is fundamentally that through object thesis. Our relationship with each other, I would say employment, and most employment is a quasi extension of servitude, where we lose the freedom of speech, we lose the freedom of manifestation of our expression. And I think it's also with our relationship with a man-made world, or the human-made world, which is a function of ownership. And I think we're about to transcend that into a whole new model of redefining those relationships. And the relationship with the future, you can argue debt, and things like debt are a mechanism of colonizing the future in any format. So these four dimensions, I think, are about to be fundamentally transformed. And by implication, they transform who we are as individuals, because that recomprehension of what it means to be human has to be transformed. But it also transformed the world around us and how we relate to it. And you're seeing this future already being played out. You're starting to see whether it's about self-sovereign rivers in New Zealand, or whether it's actually all the way through to looking at the future, new financial instruments which avoid the thesis of debt and control and colonization of the future in different formats, we're creating new biases towards that, re-examinations of the thesis of labor as a predefined unit of activity, new more forms of relationships around that, whether it's new mechanisms of organizing that are heralded by boundless systems like blockchain, which open up a new way of organizing at a center, all the way through to actually, whether it's self-sovereign, we're working on something like self-sovereign house, where the house itself is an independent public entity. We are stewards of that house in a new framework. So I think we're in the middle of this revolution, a revolution of independence to interdependence, and that fundamentally transforms all the major structural relationships that have manifested the world that we see around us. That transformation is the revolution. I think it's happening, and it's happening in the contractual, how we code our relationships, whether I code our relationships to things, flows, value, capital, and mechanisms. And that would be my manifesto for the near future.
Tremendous, fantastic. Interdependences has become a word that has been very much at the forefront of my thinking and acting in recent years, Indy. So I'm totally with you on all these points and this need to reconfigure our relationship with the future. And I'm writing the second edition of my Master Planning Futures book, which is going to look very little like the one I published, 9 years ago. Seems so long ago. But I completely take the point about the need to challenge the status quo on all fronts, and the benefits of globalization have really not been evenly distributed, and that we've also completely failed to deal with so many structural challenges. So we need the radical change, because Daniel Shamet-Burgos, the founder of the Emergence Project, you probably know pretty well, I think he said recently, we've constructed society on loss aversion and control, as opposed to to ennobling and unleashing. And so you maintain that for us to democratize the power to create society in our cities in the way that we innovate and organize ourselves, we have to look more closely, as you've said in a number of your lectures, at capital, knowledge, and agency. But you warn against simple magic bullets. How could you say a bit more about that? Because I completely take the point that magic bullets everyone wants so much are just not going to cut it at this point.
Well, I think for me this goes into the heart of democracy in a way, and I would agree with Daniel that I think one of the fundamental problems has been that we have constructed a world which is largely, and all those four dimensions I spoke about, the future, the kind of nature, sort of human-made materials and people, our relationship has been that of control. And regulation and governance has been a thesis of centralized control, controlling something and creating limited zones of possibility for something. It's a control, top-down articulation. I think the challenge we face is we have entered an age of interdependence, whether we like it or not. And in an age of interdependence, actually centralized ex-ante prediction of what is the right thing is virtually impossible. And actually change is not a function of ex-ante centralized prediction of it, but is actually about the movement, building a multitude of agents acting together with shared intent or shared purpose over time, which is learning together and able to hold contradictions together. So at that moment in time, if we want to preserve democracy, and by democracy I mean is the agency of agents to act with integrity from their own position. And if that's a thesis, and remember most management theory, and I think master planning for me is an extension of management theory in most places, is based on a manager managing the thing and creating limited zones of roles and responsibilities as a cascading model of control. And a cascading model of control only works in a linear, predictable pathway. In a complex emergent pathway, it doesn't work. You need distributed intelligence, agency, care to be continuously adjusting, learning, sense making, and iterating in its intervention. And that requires us to build a model where innovation is not centralized in the hands of the few, but you build the innovation capacity of the system as a whole. That also means that you have to build the sense-making capacity of the system as a whole. This also means you have to build actually the care of the inherent care in the system as a whole, which also means that you have to create a model which isn't driven by externalized or external extrinsic models of control. So financial incentives are a quasi-external or an extrinsic model of control. They are trying to control your behaviors through giving you incentives. That model of control and influence is effectively problematic in a world where you want decentralized care, creativity, cognition, and innovation. And that requires agency and governance to be at the distributed end of it. That is going to be vital and I think this is the vital challenge of democracies. I think why we're all passively falling into autocratic models of control is because we do not have an alternative to management theory. And most governments are falling into a quasi-management theory model of change, which is driving autocracy as the only viable mechanism to drive change. Whereas what we do need is a different model, which is built on building distributed agency, distributed innovation capacity, distributed consciousness of our interdependence, recognition of all different new accounting mechanisms to recognize our interdependence of value chains and our linkages as opposed to our isolatable value. So it requires quite a different foundational behavior to be able to manifest some of these futures.
Yes, and then I suppose I take it that also means that we need devolution to go along with, in order to give distributed agency a greater mandate.
Yeah, I think so, but I'm slightly hesitant on this one. So often devolution is just a new space of tyranny as well. So you devolve power from one higher level to another higher level of tyranny. I think that this is not devolution, but radical distribution and decentralization, which is not necessarily inherent in devolution, which is, I think, largely been interpreted as going from the federal control to the national control to the local control. That's still a cascading model of control. Yeah. Whereas I think we need there's a different hypothesis here.
Okay, great, thank you. So over to Prathima.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating. In a way, you're reimagining governance and how our society is organized. It'd be nice to see a world where there's decentralized agency, creativity, and kind of sense making. It'd be nice to see that, because then you kind of are creating a society of problem solvers. And,
I don't think we have a choice, Prathima. Just to come in here, I think in a complex emergent world, we are only left with the choice of the tyranny of massive autocracy, which is, I think, a model in the future. Massive, agile, centralized systems, machine learning enabled, highly autocratic, which limit the freedom, and I don't mean the freedom of escape, but the freedom to create in the hands of the few, to another model. And I think this is an ideological pivot moment. And one assumes that you can predict the world. One assumes you cannot predict the world. You have to create the conditions to make the world, right? And and I think this is the kind of almost that dual landscape that we're in the middle of. And I think we're seeing the global civilization slowly polarize into those two
Yeah.
positional pathways. And I think it's absolutely fundamental that I think the big revolution of our age is the revolution of human capacity, reimagining humans from not being bad robots, but being actually sources of. It is not. It is impossible for me as one human to be able to predict, allocate the role of another human being. Actually, my role is to create platform for their care, creativity, and highly complex intelligence to unflourish and become. And that's not about extrinsic models of control, but actually about creating the conditions for fulfillment. And when we go in that, I think what's really important is that our cities start to transform. So, for example, economic precariousness. So, if you make people economically fragile, right, and you make people precarious in their economic livelihoods and their ability to live, you make them more vulnerable to fear. You make them more fragile and vulnerable to fear. As a result of being more fragile and vulnerable to fear, they buy and consume different things. This is real. As you buy and consume different things, so we know in economic recessions, people will buy chocolate or they will buy, chocolate buying goes up, hairdressing goes up, fashion, sort of like quick consumables goes up, because they're all about emotional cognitive scaffolding when people are vulnerable. People don't actually think long term, they think increasingly short term. So when you've created a society intentionally at a social neurological level to actually create a cognitive space which is limited and short term, I think we have limited the human development capacity. So if we want a different society, we have to create a different context. And that applies at the financial level, it applies at the air pollution level. We know air pollution takes away 1 year's worth of education. We know actually light pollution takes away quality of sleep, which actually has distortive impacts on the human capacity. We know micro-violence, whether it's racism or any other forms of micro-violence, which is just the words, not the physical violence, actually increases levels of cortisone, reduces people's life expectancy up to 10 years. So if we're going to create this new human development age, we have to create the conditions, a new idea of conditions, which is about unfolding the full majesty and capacity of being human. And this new capacity has to be in symbiosis with a new machine and ecological age. So I think this is about a theory of practice in a really radical format, which is beyond management. Sorry, I came in halfway through your point, Prathama.
But I also, I want to kind of dig deep on that point about cities as well. And I know in your work, you speak about these invisible frameworks and structures that shape us, especially our cities. That could be regulation, it could be financial mechanisms, economic policy, procurement.
Yep.
Of services. Talk to us a little bit about that, and give us tangible examples of how these factors impact the cities that we live in.
Okay, so I'll give you a simple example. If you wanted to go outside your house and start playing music, you would almost certainly need some form of licensing mechanism. That mechanism of licensing is pretty much probably what's been there for the last 50 years, maybe 100 years, of how we license public space. Actually, our ability to radically reimagine our frameworks of licensing and licensing any form of public space as a result of changing the digitization of that act of licensing, just that. So you could go out there with your phone and go, I want to do this here in this location. And you put your phone down and it's got the sensors which record all the effects. You've created a revolution of how we use the city just by transforming that space of licensing. Because that generates, that unleashes all this space that's lying dormant into creating a whole new relationship with the world. So that's a very small instance of looking at that. A deeper instance is the idea of land. Land ownership. Is the idea of land ownership appropriate? So again, do we have to start to think more radically about not owning land, but being in treaty with land? So we know that actually, so there is an ecological potential of a piece of land, which is actually if we own, we tend to actually subvert and make ours. We use regulations to be able to control that subversion. But largely, the thesis of ownership has been about putting into service to me as a human, not recognizing the plurality of benefits that that land creates for all, not only civilization, but ecological systems and other things around it. So how do we have a new type of relationship that extends beyond ownership, all the way through to use licensing? So the use classes in cities are really old-fashioned traditional ideas of how we organize a city. They're based on an industrial age where the cost of bureaucracy was very high, so we tended to license things by saying this will be the use class of something. But I find the idea of organizing the world through use and function increasingly problematic in a world of agile use. And what we need to be thinking about is affordances, how spatial affordances are constructed, and how do we start to create a whole new affordance, aggregate affordance capacity of that story. Now let's think about how we finance our cities. So we're doing a lot of work around how we do perpetual bonds. So looking at financing housing as infrastructure as opposed to housing as an individual asset. We're doing a lot of work around where a house owns itself and you are a steward of that house because the house is a public interest, independent public infrastructure where it effectively owns itself, and it's financed through a smart perpetual bond. And that means that you are a steward of that house. You're not a renter, and you're not an owner, but you have an in perpetuity relationship, if you want, however long you live, with that house, and it diminishes in price and cost because of the way the finance is structured. So you can construct fundamentally different things, and the nature of affordability is reimagined in that story. I think even the thesis of the material economy of our cities is problematic. Most of our material economy is built on the idea that I own those materials. And actually, what I've accrued is a huge amount of liabilities in terms of the circular economy. So how do we have a new material relationship where all the materials of the house are subleased of a public interest trust, which means that these materials are shared and aggregatively owned, or not owned, stewarded for the time that the house exists, and then can be recycled, repaired in different formats. So I think all these things are a function of the contractual frame that sits around cities. And when you put these things together, you start to imagine quite a different idea of the city and its possibility.
Yeah, that's fascinating to kind of reimagine our social contract with our governments, reimagining how governments run. Yeah, that's fascinating. Lucy?
Well, this is all really a rich array of layers here, all interconnected as we expected. And one of the most provocative things I think you said in the last 10 minutes was that because it's reality, I do agree that there is no alternative to management theory when it comes to urban development. But if you were to suppose that social value is as important as it really is, and it is a phrase that's used a lot by local government these days, and then so social value coupled together with the notion of social stewarding of resources, and maybe local government in the role of facilitators, which some of the most enlightened government officials, regional government, local government figures regard themselves as, then surely you would have a situation where instead of something you said recently, that many governments aren't in a space of leadership, but they're in a space of reaction. We all know how that manifests itself. But we're considering these very kind of challenging transitions from where we are now to some much more ideal situation, but ideal processes to get us there. So Indy, I'm really curious to know more about your view on the ways in which local and regional government officials are already taking those steps, and how certain things measures they can take can hugely strengthen the momentum that they're experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many little nuances and important nuances in what you've said, actually.
Mm.
I think one of the challenges, there's multiple really critical points. I think it's really important, firstly, we do not see and nor allow to be seen the state as a singular thing. The state and the public is not a singular monolithic body, and nor should it be, because in its monolithic capacity, it would have both the monopoly of violence, rules, regulation, and money formation, and it's too much. The state has to be perceived as a multitude of independent public interest organizations that are able to be in discursive conflict with each other. And it's vital for democracies that state is not reduced to a singular act, and the public not reduced to the pyramid of the parliament. I think what we need is a multitude of bodies that are able to be in creative tension with each other. And in a world which is increasingly data-driven and data-informed, that's going to be a vital framework to not end up facing, I think, the tyranny of the state. And I think we're at risk in many places, as much from the tyranny of private enterprise and the monopolies of power as we are from the tyrannies of state. And I think this is a really structural challenge and not a nice one to talk about in a way, because we're in a way both those sectors hold so much economic power. But I think in ideal terms, I think a really good state is not about a big or small state, but is actually about its micro-massive capacities. Lots of independent agents which are able to act for the public interest in diverse formats. So one thing I just think it's really important to redefine or define that space in its ideal form. Second thing, I think even the division between public and private, I think is increasingly false. So there is no such thing as private interest. You take your house in the middle of, say, Notting Hill, and you move it into the middle of Nova Scotia. How much is the house worth? Not very much. And that's not with disrespect to Nova Scotia. The value of a house is not a function of its material value. It's a function of its access rights to labor markets, to transportation systems, to school systems. And so if houses have been inflating in value, it's not the material value of the house that's been inflating in value. It's the monopolistic access to public goods that has been inflating in value. And so what we need to start to talk about is a new idea which transcends the idea of public and private, but actually start to talk about relational value in really fundamental terms. I think then if we move further forward, I think we have to start to think we have to start to think about going beyond management theory as a means of organizing at a structural level in democracies. And democracies have to have a new way of innovating, which isn't based on this management theory model of innovation, but is actually about building the intrinsic capacities to build innovation in fundamentally different formats. So I suppose aspects of that question, it's a big question. I would break down on nuances along those lines that I think are really critical for us to move forward. And Lucy, I've not answered your question, so maybe if you could come back to me with the last bit of the question, because I think there's an important point there, but I want to set that context in frame.
No, I think you've covered quite a lot of territory there, actually, and I'm fascinated by your prescription, or let's say your proposition, that by having a whole host of different micro organizations, each with their own agencies, that is ultimately going to be more powerful, that they can be more powerful on the ground, because in a way they're going to be applying certain sort of more universal sense of what is social value as facilitators, we hope. But at the same time, they would be able to best understand and best understand their local contexts in a very bespoke way, and be active in a very bespoke way.
Exactly.
With regard to social value.
One thing it's true. It is, well, it's one aspect of it, but the other aspect I wanted to put down was that let's also remember we spend, 2 to 3% of our healthcare budget on prevention.
Right.
Most of our investment in the world in social provision is almost a cash-to-cash services problem. We get revenue in, we spend it on treatment or some form of failure to treat. So actually, what we have as an economy around our social value, which is fundamentally archaic. We do nothing to do prevention, let alone thriving. And I think prevention is just the mitigation of loss. We do not even talk about development and the thriving of that capacity. And it's also very clear that the social costs are never crystallized as liabilities which allow for sustainable investment and management. You've had you've had social impact bonds which have tried to do that, but frankly, most social impact bonds, there are a few exceptions now turning up, which are starting to be at very large scales, but most social impact bonds have been relatively small. There's a whole bunch of contractual problems. They don't operate in the timescales of social innovation, which is maybe generational or intergenerational. So there is a real question whether our dark matter around our cities really accounts for the social value, yet we create lip service to the thesis of social value, not necessarily the structural value. And I can put this very concretely on an idea of a tree. A tree outside your road is a cost to your local authority because the tree is perceived as an insurance cost, as a maintenance cost. Its environmental services, be it environmental social services, be it the heat island effects to mitigate, be it the CO2 sequestration, be it the rainwater sustainable urban drainage capacity, or be it the health capacities in terms of mental health. None of those are valued. So that results in places like Sheffield, and no disrespect to Sheffield because it wasn't about Sheffield, ended up cutting down their trees after 10 years because the maintenance costs would be too high. Because there is no counterbalance sheet, there's no balance book on the value. And trees only manifest their value at 40 years. So I think we're hearing the words, but we don't have the accounting infrastructures, and the institutional dark matter and our financial instruments don't account for any of this value, which means that we're still getting the regressive effects of most of this story, whilst the words, I agree with you, are evolving.
Yeah, and so from that, I can intuit that what you're saying also is that from so many actions which are ostensibly being taken in order to benefit the long term, unfortunately, certain things happen along the way which could have been anticipated, which actually prevent the long-term value from coming into being.
Absolutely. And it's designed at root. And it's absolutely designed at root. And, and we do not, our financial instruments, our financial economy is not geared to long-term value. We have a discount rate for the future. We discount present day value. We discount future value to present day value. So it's reduced in value over time. We do not talk about persistent value indexes, which look at the, this is some work that we're doing, which look at the persistent value of a category of asset classes, which actually will persist over long term. We don't have mechanisms, and this is one of the strategic issues for democracies, is that democracy is the ability to make decisions collectively as we choose. However, how do you invest into the long term? And one of the big challenges for democracies is that democracies have supported the long-term thinking of a very few, the super rich and the well-off, not the democratic capacity for everyone to think long term. So one of the big challenges is for democracies is how do we universalize the capacity for long-term thinking across all of society? Because autocratic systems can do this by a very few being able to think long term. And they already are. We've got 50-year plans, we've got 5-year plans. People are able to think over intergenerational value, over long-term value cycles. Democracies currently don't have the legitimacy to think about that story. And I think that's a real structural issue. And that also has to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks a lot for that. Fatima.
Lucy, I just want to, this is such an important moment to have this conversation. Indeed, the invisible systems that you've been referring to throughout this conversations are things that we don't tend to notice until things go wrong, and the pandemic and the public health crisis has triggered a widespread economic crisis, social crisis, and a governance crisis. So, in a way, this is a kind of opportunity to disrupt for better. We have to kind of build back better. So, I have two questions for you. One is, what are the capacities needed at this moment to kind of move towards the vision of the community that you are describing? And second is, how should we be rethinking these kind of invisible systems, to become levers of change to drive, a happier, equitable, healthier future?
Great questions. I suppose starting with the first one, I think the key thing for me is intentionality. I think one of the greatest things I worry about is that we've all become managerial in terms of managing comprehension, managing the future, as in how it attacks us, rather than having any form of intentionality of a future that's possible. I think if we look forth, it's really critical that we do several things. One, we have to recognize the city-urban rural divide is false. The city is a system, not a boundary mechanism. And the quicker governance and operational investment understands a city through its metabolic functions and strategically looks at those metabolic functions as vital infrastructure for its development, sustenance, and growth, the smarter we'd be. We're doing work with nation states around their transition strategy, and this becomes really critical. One, redefining the thing from the boundary-based model to a system-based model. Two, looking at the trends, drivers, and impacts on those systems as a whole, and how do you build the strategic risk management capacity to manage those risks that are emerging in the trends and drivers to those metabolic. That requires us to build portfolios of options and hedges against those risks. And that is where innovation is not a add-on, a fun thing that you do at the end of the day. It is an intrinsic part of strategically managing the risks in a new age of long emergencies. Three, scaffolding, effectively a human-machine ecological development thesis, recognizing we're in a phase of transformation of what it means to be human, transformation of the capacities of our machine economies, transformation of our ecological systems. That scaffolding that is going to be vital. And fourth is actually building a new system, capacities, shifting the properties of the system to be able to deal with uncertainty. Whilst we're living in an age of risk, we're also living in an age of increasing uncertainty. In a complex emergent world susceptible to shocks, that is exactly where we are. The ability to deal with uncertainty is largely about building the anti-fragile capacity of that system, which is about the distributed innovation and capacity, sense-making capacity, and other capabilities of the system. Those properties have to shift if we're going to operate in this age. So I think transition for me will require us to think about how we govern and manage transition in fundamentally different ways, which isn't about somebody saying, here's my plan, here's my vision. It's actually about building systemic institutional capabilities in radical ways to be able to deal with it.
Thank you, Indy, for that comment. I think there's a lot for us to think about. And so, like I said, it's a very important moment to think about these things, because the pandemic continues to rage on, and it's really kind of testing all of our kind of social capacity, governance capacity. So hopefully we can innovate and kind of really deliver on the promise of.
Prathama, as you say, pandemic is only the beginning of a story, right? I mean, This is only the beginning of this age. I mean, if you look at any of we're heading towards a 3 degrees climate change world.
Yeah.
We're heading through at least a 3.5 degrees.
This seems like somebody made there was a headline There was a headline in one of the magazines which said that this seems like a preview to the climate emergency, which everyone's been talking about. So we really have to rebuild our world to tackle that
Exactly.
big
And I
that's
think,
coming our way.
but just on that, right, this is I think it's a really critical issue. You know, we're just in the process of building a program which is looking at zero net zero, but 3 degrees adaptation. We are almost certainly, with all the data, heading to a 3 to 3.5 degrees world. And that is incredible and in a really bad way. So, and it's differentially incredible, right? So what it will do to the global north and what it will do to the global south is not the same. What it will do to global food baskets is not the same what it will do in the global south and global north. If you put 3 degrees on average, you're talking about 6 degrees in some cities, if not more. Parts of India, for example, living at 50 degrees for many months in the year, which is life terminating. So we are into a very difficult situation. And I think we have to start to think through the lens of the scale of the transition we're in the middle of. This does not mean we cannot do it, but I think it's really important we recognize the deep adaptation that we're going to face at a global level to be able to deal with it. I totally agree with you that this is just the beginning of a story. It's a sort of a prelogue to the narrative that's really about to begin.
Yeah. Lucy?
Yeah, we've now struck an incredibly somber note in our discussion, and there's a profundity to every single aspect of our conversation. If we turn to looking at the field of systems thinking in economics at the moment, myself and many other people can see, on many levels, it's alive and kicking with so many brilliant women economists working, like Mariana Mazzucato, Kate Raworth, Carlota Perez, Esther Duflo, who also works with her husband, Abhijit Banerjee. And all of them ostensibly reimagining capitalism in a world on fire, to quote the title of this new book by Rebecca Henderson, who is management and strategy professor at Harvard Business School. How do you, there are many people I've cited, so it may be too big a question, but how do you rate some of their contributions recently to try to overcome the fragile and social and broken social contracts that societies are experiencing?
World class. I think they're so important. Mm-hmm. I think Kate, Mariana, certainly they're people I know personally. I have nothing but the greatest things to be said for them, for what they're doing. I think they're shifting the fundamental frames that need to be shifted. They're creating space in the political landscape for new conversations, which I think are fundamental. So I have nothing but the highest things to be said for people creating that space, and I think they're creating the space for many of the things that we're all discussing, and it's interesting for me that there is a whole generation of absolutely world-class, brilliant economists, women who are actually leading us in this future, which I have nothing but the highest things to say for. Other than that, I think it's really important, and I wish there were more. My actual personal worry is that there's too few. Still, I think we need more. I have a worry that there's a paucity of thinking actually in the system. I have a systemic worry that actually the culture of just do it has created a framework of valuing people only by the frameworks of what they can do within the preconceived system, as opposed to people that can theoretically and philosophically challenge the system. I think, urban theory respectfully doesn't exist meaningfully as a practice, and it should do. I think the academic literature in urban theory, if I want really good stuff, I'll be looking at data scientists, I'll be looking at completely different people. So I think there is a deficit of leadership in and a deficit of academic rigor in 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 our urban geography and urban geography of living frameworks that I think is missing. So I think we need more, much more. We need many more brilliant women leading this story, because I think there's a great need for real cognitive thought. I think some of this, by the way, is a function of the nature of disciplines, that much of urban thinking is fundamentally a polymathic act. I think to think about urban systems requires you to think about polymathic capabilities at the intersection of multiple capabilities. And our education system is largely driven towards siloization, not the enhancement of polymathic thinking. And what that's meant is that we've ended up with most polymathic thinking being largely impressionistic, i.e., single point of views, because we're just not funding the research. We're not just funding the deep comprehension of this stuff. When, there is very little written on, the amount of papers, schizophrenia is twice as high in urban environments than any of the other environments. Twice as high in urban environments. There is virtually there's, I think, 1 or 2 case studies in the world looking at why is schizophrenia twice as high in urban environments. And if you look at the paucity of real academic research, I think we're completely underfunded. I wish certainly in the UK university had, 20 PhDs in genuinely urban studies and really advanced formats using new capabilities. So fantastic. I stand on the shoulders of women such as Kate and Marie and Mariana, who do extraordinary stuff, but I think we need many more.
Is there one particular area that you think that needs greater attention, that could be taken, somebody could take up the cudgels for, an emerging economist?
For an emerging economist,
you might be watching right now and thinking about their areas of action.
So, I can tell you where our mind's at the DM, and DM we've got finance people, we've got coders, we've got researchers with 45-person team around the world. So my worldview on this at this moment in time is, I think there's a new class of value models that are forming, which are acting like economies. So when you start to think about how do you plant a network of forests across a city to deal with heat island and all these effects that I've suddenly talked about, that isn't about a business model. That's an ecosystem of value model. And being able to model and think about things through a co-beneficiary lens and interdependence of both monetary and non-monetary systems. Not everything is the monetary system. I think there's a whole new way of operationalizing this stuff that's emerging. Certainly that's where our work is going. And being able to think about those things in really radical formats is going to be key.
That's brilliant. I want to hand back to Prathima, but I just wanted to quickly ask you, whether that's something you proposed to the Mayor of London.
The Mayor of London is, Mayor of London, I don't think the Mayor of London is right now, there's a whole election going on. I think there's a lot of stuff that's been done. I think London needs, my view on London is probably the most best way I can say this, is that I think London is in danger of massive regression. London is sitting into a 1970s future right now, if some of us remember it, because I think the economic engine to which London stood is dead. And we will need to have to reimagine the economy of London to which it was instrumentalized. We were instrumentalized to a very particular economy. I think we have to reimagine London for the 21st century in really deep radical reform sense. We have to rebuild London. I think this is as grave a hit to the idea of London as we've ever seen. And Brexit has just merely accelerated what was already in play. And if you put some of the things together, I think the idea of an 8 million, 15 million person city in the future has to be deeply reimagined. Also, politically, London is a person non grata in the politics of the UK, which is now currently all about levelling up. And London will have to reintegrate itself back into the UK and re-establish itself as a system in the UK as opposed to being independent of the UK. And I think that requires real structural transformation of London and its idea of London and the value of London, how we create value. I think we need deep radical reform if London's going to be relevant in the next 10 years.
Wow, no pressure then. I think so. I think we got time for Prathima to ask one more question, and then I think I saw we have an audience question. So over to you, Prathima.
Okay, my last question is, I just want to point out that the choices that we make in the next few years can either kind of lock us in economic development pattern that will potentially do permanent and escalating damage to our ecological system, or if we, change our road, maybe promote a more healthier, fairer, and greener world, and that's one of the biggest levers of change that we have to think about. How do we reimagine finance and economic models? So, any thoughts on that? How can especially from the perspective of moving towards the ecological layer, how can we reimagine financing mechanisms and economic models to build back better?
No, it's a really, really good question. So I'm going to, like every other question probably, I'm going to slightly subvert it but to get to your intent, which is, I think the first thing is, and this is controversial what I'm about to say, so bear with me. I'm not a big fan of degrowth. Now, lots of people get angry with me about now. And what I mean by that is it is definitely true we have to degrow our material economy and our externalities that are generated from our current material economy, right? I think we have to degrow obviously all of our oil and gas derivatives economy. So we have to degrow all of this stuff. At the same time, we have to be able to grow the idea of human capacity and human development into a new age. So for me, this is not an argument that we have to degrow all of economy. It is true that our economy currently overprices and overvalues the material economy. But the rise of intangible assets, the rise of intangible value, we are already seeing a transition from understanding the value from not being locked to material, but to actually interdependent sort of models of sort of this post-material intangibles economy. So I think it's one, really critical to do that. Two, what that means is that we have to reimagine our material economy in a foundationally different way. And the rise of a biomaterial economy, I think, is going to be fundamentally vital for a transition. So we have to be able to do that in really, really smart way. And if we're going to reimagine our biomaterial, and this biomaterial, energy, water, nutrition economy has to be really, really reimagined. At the same time, what we have to do is really foundationally grow our human development economy and what it means to be human and the human contribution to the system, as well as our machine automation economy, as well as our ecological regenerative capacities. These things have to grow. And this is the challenge that we face, is our language tends to put us into polar opposites, not recognizing that we can actually, our economy is not one thing, but a multitude of things. And it's worth recognizing that in the first industrial revolution in 1800, in the 18th century, 1750s and onwards, Andy Haldane from the Bank of England says this very elegantly, where he says that one of the good reasons that the UK was able to make the Industrial Revolution was it had already done some degree of educational reform. In 1833 and 1834, it had already started to do also advanced educational reform, made it, I think, mandatory to go to school for certain periods. So what we've seen is a framework where every industrial revolution and every transformation is building the democratic capacities to increase our human capabilities and support the scaffolding of them. And I think that is going to be a key part of the revolution as we transform other things. Now, what that means is you have to create a different idea of the context, and that's just not schools. So it's not about institutional logics of schools, but creating the conditions for deep learning everywhere. It's about creating the mental health investments, mental health as a foundational infrastructure for this new society. So I think it's not about growth and degrowth. It's actually about this kind of frameworks of actually certain things being de-emphasized, certain things being emphasized, and scaffolding those things in really smart ways. And that transition is going to be critical. Behind that sits new ways of financing intangible assets. Intangible assets have how do we finance mental health of a city? It is surely the most foundational economic infrastructure of the 21st century. Again, we've been doing work with the Stockholm region, looking at this one problem. How do you see mental health as a foundational infrastructure? Because the cognitive emotional care capability of the citizens of a city is almost fundamentally the core asset of a city. So I think that financial innovations are going to be required around these intangible human ecological assets, whether it's how do you finance a forest, how do you finance the mental health capabilities, how do you finance the decision-making capabilities of society, and how do you finance actually the imagination capacity of society. These things are going to be critical for the transition. And that's going to be, I think, some of the big economic questions of our age.
That's fascinating. We need financial innovations for, kind of owning our intangible assets like the human capacity and the ecology of our lands. I think that's amazing. Lucy?
Did we have an audience question from Georgina Turner, I think.
Yes, I just want to say hello to the amazing audience who seem to be joining us from everywhere. We have Zuba here from South Africa. Mr. Ashok Goyal says it's an interesting discussion. Naveen Rai, he's an alumni of LSE and the government of Sikkim. So we have government listening in too, which is amazing. And I'm going to take Georgina Turner's question. Where she says the mention of the fear of managerial. Well, there is climate change to manage, and on the human level, the growth in population. How can we not have a managerial approach to these challenges? That's the question.
Yeah, so two really important questions to Mary. One, I would say, climate change is a symptom of a more fundamental failure. Climate change itself is not the failure, it is a symptom. The failure is actually in our thesis of how we govern our externalities. Unpriced, regressive externalities of the things that we do, the violence that we make in everyday affairs, which is now feedbacking back into creating a self-terminating situation for us as a global civilization. So this is it's worth us recognizing what the problem really is. And the problem is so massively interdependent, and it's a Gordian knot of a problem. Even with the global pandemic, I think that at its peak, we only had a 7% reduction in carbon. This was all planes shut down, virtually most travel shut down, 7% reduction, right? And most of that has bounced back already. So when we talk about, and we have to do 7% year on year fix to get any of the things that we're talking about. So I think one of the things I'd say is that I don't think managerialism, which is about the imposition from the authority of who has the authority to do this. And I think one of the challenges of democracies is, are we willing in this moment of crisis, and this is maybe an argument, but I leave that open to other people. In this moment of crisis, do we believe the best way forward is to allocate authority to a single actor or actors to manage our carbon? Or do we have to create a new pathway of building a transition pathway which builds new coherence across that? I think it's a really profound question. And it does link into the population level question. I, for one, am always unnerved when people say we have too high a population, because I'm like, in which perspective do you have to put yourself to be able to say that? Because you have to distance yourself far enough to say that somebody else did not deserve to live or does not deserve to live in the future. So I don't even want to enter that mind frame, because I think that's a mind frame of view on the world, which is problematic. It can only build a form of tyranny in its thesis. Whereas we all know that the global populations, every country's population has stabilized and becomes completely different, transformed itself by creating the conditions for human flourishing. If you can create the safety and the conditions for human flourishing, population pressures naturally die away. So I worry about the lens, and I'm sorry to be so clear on this, but and maybe I'm wrong as well, but the lens of population. I was in a call, we said, so thought I was Indian, which obviously I am from Indian descent, but somebody, and I've been working in India for a while, but turned around and sort of said, India is overpopulated. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Can you say that? Do you have the right to say that? Do you even have the right to think that? Is that kind of a form of, is that fair? Do we want that sort of conversation? I think if we do the thriving, we solve the population pressures. And remember, the world is more than capable of sustaining 10 million people, 10 billion people, even 12 billion people. The problem is not the 10 billion. It's the 500 million that's the problem. So we really need to be very clear. It is not the 10 billion that's the issue. The issue is the over-oppression of 500 million people and the effects that we create, all of us, create on the world. So I think I wish I was a moral philosopher here, because I think there's something really important in the question. So I thank you for asking it, because it's pregnant in all our minds. But I think there's some very important frames that we need to be deeply careful about, and what pathways they open up in terms of path dependencies of thought, agency, act, and power that I think we need to resist.
I think that's amazing kind of. Yeah,
speechless, really. I mean, you are a moral philosopher, and a one-man think-do tank as well. But are you? I mean, the model of dark matter labs as a global network is a very compelling one. And I think that you've mapped out today such a lot of really compelling transition pathways. I mean, the way forward is quite daunting, and there's so many, as I said, somber aspects to our condition. I mean, if we plunge in and try and loosen the knots, the Gordian knot of problems, try and loosen the tension, we run the risk of just annihilating ourselves potentially. But on the other hand, we don't really have any alternative, as you say. So I think it's the one. Is it the half a billion population whose very damaging extractive capacities are the ones that we're worrying about? It was an immense conversation. I really, really appreciate what you've said, Indy, and Prathama and I really are kind of galvanized in our path forward ourselves as people who purport to run think-do tanks too. So thank you so much.
It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for hosting this conversation, and thank you for doing these interviews, which you are doing with many other brilliant people that you bring on board. I had the pleasure to listen to at least 2 of them. So I would like to thank you personally for doing what you're doing, which I think is a really important service as well.
Thank you so much. And you are indeed one of our most polymathic so far. Genuine. Prathama, do you want to add to what I said?
No, thank you so much. I think this was such a meaningful conversation. And like Lucy said, you galvanized us and our audience. And I think we need to think about these difficult and important things, constantly. And I really want to thank you for spending this hour with us and, making us think about these important subjects. And thank you everyone for joining us as well. And we will be back to you in a few weeks with another important conversation. Thank you again. Have a great day and safe and stay well during this pandemic.
Thank you.